Okay, welcome to the third and final video thinking about card counting strategies in Blackjack. As we've seen before, some cards are good for the players, some are bad for the players. Now let's think about how you actually can use card counting to potentially earn a positive player value or player advantage. So here's basically the goal. Here's what you're trying to do. You're trying to maximize your exposure. When I say exposure, I mean how much money you're putting in. You want to maximize your exposure to the game when it's favorable, and you want to minimize your exposure when it's not. Okay? So what I mean by that is you want to maximize it when there's lots of 10s and 9s still remaining in the shoe, and few of those other cards that are not so good for the player. So if you can find a game with lots of 10s and 9s remaining, and few of these 2, 3, 4s, and 5s and 6s remaining, you've got a favorable game. And you could actually, we're not going to get into this in this class, but you can actually solve for how big or small the player advantage might be if you're in this scenario here. Okay? So let's think about how you do this. How do you maximize exposure? Well, you bet more. If you go find a random table in Vegas, it might have a minimum buy-in or a minimum bet of $10, and it might have a maximum bet of $5,000. So you can kind of imagine if the game is very favorable, you would want to bet thousands of dollars on the next hand. So that's how you maximize exposure. Just bet more. Minimizing exposure means, of course, you could bet less or you could quit. The problem here, though, is that card counters will be stopped. A lot of times card counting is frowned upon by the casinos. It's not illegal, okay? I mentioned that line in The Hangover before. I'm not going to say it here in a recorded video, but it's not illegal, but it is frowned upon. And in fact, if you go to a casino and you're card counting, there's a pretty good chance that they're going to ask you to quit playing. All right? And they'll be polite about it at first, but if you keep coming back up and playing over and over again, you may get banned, you may get roughed up a little bit. There's evidence that they do that sometimes. But essentially, they're going to stop you from playing it. The casino loses money if you are a card counter who's pretty strategic, so they're going to stop you from playing. So the problem here is you might think, well, just look at a table and just watch it all day until it turns favorable, then sit down and bet $5,000, right? That would be dramatic card counting. They're not going to let you do that most likely, all right? The dealer is going to have some idea usually if the game is favorable for the players. And if you walk up and say, I'll bet $5,000 on the next hand, they're just going to say no, right? They're just going to stop you from doing it. They're a private company, so they basically can do whatever they want. They can choose whether or not to provide service to you. So you kind of have to toe the line here. When it comes to maximizing your exposure, you probably can't bet the table maximum. And when it comes to minimizing your exposure, you probably can't bet none. You probably can't just sit there and wait for the game to get good. You've got to decide how aggressive you want to be. If you're extremely aggressive and you're betting the maximum, they're probably going to tell you to stop. If you're too timid and you're only doubling your bet when the game is really good, you're probably not going to be able to swing it towards a positive player advantage in the long run. So you need a big enough of a spread, okay? So let's get into some of the key ideas to card counting. So these are things to think about when you're sitting down at a table. Let's say you decide you really want to try to count cards, right? You can go to Vegas, you can do this. You can go, try it online in a simulator and see how you do. Here's some things you'll need to think about. We've talked about this before in class, but you would need to think about the number of decks. In general, single deck blackjack is really good to play. But it's not good for card counting. In single deck blackjack, you usually can't see the other player's cards, and they only deal out one hand. So you're not getting much information, right? If an ace has been taken out of the deck, you don't really know that because you only get to see your two cards and the one exposed dealer card. So it's not really enough information. So the number of decks matters. In general, fewer decks is better for card counting, but then again, the rules matter. Are you going to be able to see each other's cards? Are you going to be able to see the other player's cards? other rules beyond the number of decks. Things like, does Blackjack pay 3 to 2? If Blackjack pays 6 to 5, it doesn't matter how good of a card counter you are, you're not going to be able to make a profit on that game. So the types of rules and things that we've talked about in the past are still key considerations. You can't just go to a random table and start playing and card counting. You need to know what rules the game has. So diving in a bit deeper here to some of the key ideas. If you start researching blackjacks and stuff, blackjack strategy, you might find this term penetration a lot. Penetration refers to how far trying to figure out a good way to word this. Penetration refers to how far the dealer deals from the shoe before a reshuffle. So, getting back to my deck here, or rather my shoe, this is a 6-deck shoe. The dealer's not going to deal all the way through this. Okay, there's a couple reasons why they're not going to deal all the way through it. One is they may run out of cards. All right, if they run out of cards, what are they going to have to do? They're going to have to reshuffle, and that's a bad look. Casino's not going to do that. But the more important reason they're not going to do this is, theoretically, if we dealt this thing all the way down with only 1 card remaining, you could know exactly what that card is. That's a very vulnerable position for a casino to be in. Shuffling cards takes time, all right? So casinos would prefer to not have to shuffle cards because they're not earning any revenue when they're shuffling. But they got to shuffle somewhat frequently because if you deal this thing all the way down to the very end of the shoe, the players are going to have a pretty distinct advantage if they're card counting. So penetration refers to how far they're going to go. And most of the time, they deal about 75% of the shoe, okay? And you might be able to ask the dealer, how far, what's your penetration? How far do you go in the shoe before you reshuffle? Problem is, though, if you ask the dealer that, they're probably going to realize that you're counting cards. So you might just have to just watch, try to find some information online, to figure out what they're doing because they're not all the same. If you find out that they're only dealing half the shoe, do you think that'd be good or bad news? If they're only dealing half the shoe, that's bad news. Because if you only take 1 card out of the deck, that really doesn't tell you that much, right? Only 1 card out of this big shoe with over 300 cards in it isn't really all that meaningful. Where card counting is most meaningful is when you withdraw a bunch of cards, right? If you take out half the deck, now every time you take out a card, it's more meaningful, okay? So the more penetration, the better. So that's a key consideration when you're thinking about trying to count cards. All right, we kind of already got into this idea a bit ago, but now let me give you the terminology. Another term you might see if you start researching this stuff is spread. Spread usually refers to how small your bets are going to be when the table is bad, so like when you know the game is not in your favor, versus how big your bets are going to be when the table is really good, okay? So it's the, just to give you an example here, you might hear somebody saying they're doing a 1-8 spread, okay, a 1-8 spread. What they mean by that is they're going to bet maybe $10 when the game is not favorable, and then they're going to bet $80 when the game is favorable, okay? We mentioned before, you could bet the table minimum and then the table maximum when the game's in your favor, but the casino is going to stop you. So you're trying to toe that line. You're trying to successfully count cards in a way that gives you an advantage without being so obvious. So a 1-8 spread would look like this, okay? And you can imagine there's other possibilities. There's a 1-10 spread, a 1-15 spread. There's different strategies where you gradually increase the amount you're betting so it doesn't look so obvious. But spread is an important consideration. In general, the bigger the spread, the more you can expect to win in the long run. All right, so the bigger the spread, the higher the player advantage. And to be clear, you can absolutely have a pretty big player advantage in Blackjack if you find a game that has good rules where you can get away with a big spread, right? So if you can find a game that allows you to do a 150 spread, oh yeah, huge player advantage. You could make a ton of money on a game like that. However, if you're looking at all this and you're saying, I would really like to try to count cards, let me tell you, I don't advise that you try it, okay? And the main reason this is just the volatility. Counting cards is incredibly volatile, all right? So it might have a positive player advantage. Let's say you might find a game that gives you a 0.5% house advantage. But think about the volatility, okay? What this spread basically means is you're going to bet a little bit when the game's not in your favor, but you're going to bet a lot when the game is in your favor. And when it's in your favor, it's only going to be in your favor for, maybe 1 or 2%. Well, it's going to be very volatile, all right? If you're only betting $5 most of the time, but then when the game's in your favor, you start betting 500, well, those few hands where you're betting 500 are going to be critical to deciding if you're successful or not. So card counting is incredibly volatile. To increase the odds or to have a relative possibility that you're going to win, basically, if you're going to go to Vegas for 3 days and card count, the game is going to be so volatile, there's no telling if you're going to win or not. So in order to be pretty sure that you're going to make a profit, you need to have enough money that you can wager it for hours and hours and days. You need to have tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars to even think about doing this for true profits, right? For a living or something. So it's just incredibly volatile. So it can give you a positive player advantage, all right? You can do card counting professionally. There are people who do it for a living. But the volatility really cannot be understated. It is massive, massive volatility, okay? So ultimately, what you might think is, how am I going to do this? What are my card counting strategies? Well, we've already started thinking about these strategies. You want to think about the rules that the game has. You want to think about the penetration that the casino is using, and you want to think about the spread that you're going to utilize. But beyond that, there's different ways to card count. One possibility is to memorize all cards that have been played. Every single card that has been played, remember that. It's possible. I suspect there are people who can do that, but that's going to be very tough. Blackjack moves quickly, right? They're dealing these things out very quickly. And you're not looking at just your cards, right? You're looking at all the players that are playing with you. And typically, you get about 6 people playing at a table plus the dealer. So you're trying to count all of those cards that are coming out. This is going to be really tough. So this would be ideal, but it's not feasible. So instead, you might keep account of key cards. So rather than trying to think about all the specific cards, you might narrow it down. I said earlier in I believe the last video, that 7s and 8s aren't really all that important. 8s are slightly good for players on net. 7s are slightly bad for players on net. But you could sort of just imagine, let's just ignore all the 7s and 8s, okay? That can simplify things a bit. And that's what you'll see if you start researching online and looking at different strategies, is to really think about the cards that matter the most. Those cards tend to be 10s and aces, and then cards that are not good for you, 4s and 5s, things like that. To give you guys an example of a simple strategy you could use, I'm going to show you guys the ace-5 strategy that you can find on Wizard of Odds, which is probably the simplest way to count cards in a way that still yields potential player advantages if the rules are right. All right, so I'll see you guys via email, I guess, and that's the end of the card counting demonstration.